All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is William Mannix, and I'm going to talk you through the foundations of the British Labour Party today. So, to place history in context, the British Labour Party was founded at the beginning of the 20th century and the end of the 19th century. But to really understand it, I think we need to begin this lesson at the end of the 18th century, back when the Industrial Revolution was first kicking off. So, just so that we're all on the same page, in Britain we had this thing referred to as the enclosure movement. And the enclosure movement existed in the late 18th century, really. And it was the organized effort to undo serfdom, feudalism, that sort of economic condition that we found ourselves in throughout the Middle Ages. And as we see the enclosure movement take off, we begin to note that people, serfs, former serfs, are being thrown off the land they've worked for centuries, and many of them are ending up as paupers, vagabonds, homeless people, hungry, starving, dying of disease in the streets. Meanwhile, other ex-serfs are going off and they are finding employment, desperately trying to avoid that same fate of being hungry and starving and dying in the streets. And they work for very, very low wages in very less than ideal working conditions in the new industrial factories of the Industrial Revolution. So this is really the condition of the working class in Britain throughout the 19th century. This, I think, really sets the stage for how these people were living. So, the enclosure movement is something in the distant past. The Industrial Revolution becomes reality. The working class in Britain mostly works in industrial factories, long hours, pittance wages. And this is just the way that things are at this point. But then we see a series of reforms throughout the 19th century. These are the voting reform bills, okay? Acts of Parliament that were going to expand upon those within the electorate. And the first voting reform act that we see occurs in 1832. And the purpose of the first voting reform bill is to break up what we refer to very often as rotten boroughs. So the whole idea of a rotten borough is that you have these constituencies that have an individual who is a member of Parliament, and he's representing the constituency. And at one time in the past, that constituency had lots of constituents, but now in the 19th century, they don't have very many constituents anymore. So you had some constituencies where there were only a few people, maybe 5 people living in the entire area, and thus you had 5 people with equal representation to thousands of people. And there were approximately 140 different constituencies within the House of Commons at this point that people regarded as probably being rotten boroughs, so they needed to clean this up. And it was mostly an effort of redistricting within the constituencies of the House of Commons. Then we have 2 more voting reform bills. These are passed in 1867 and 1884. And these go a step farther than taking down the rotten boroughs. They attack what we often call pocket boroughs. These are constituencies that still have lots and lots of constituents, but based on the laws that dictated who had the vote in 19th century Britain, most of the constituents were ineligible to vote. So the whole idea is to break up the pocket boroughs by expanding upon who can vote. You had pocket boroughs like, for example, take Manchester, the city of Manchester. Manchester is an industrial center, huge industrial center, lots of factories, lots of poor working people, and none of them can vote. And you have just a handful of wealthier people in Manchester, and they get to vote and thus represent thousands of people. And that's a pocket borough. So the whole idea of the second and third voting reform bills is to create a situation where more people can vote. So by the end of the third voting reform bill in 1884, now everyone who owns their home can vote regardless of income, which doesn't enfranchise every working man in England, but it enfranchises enough that we're now in a new situation where the concerns and the opinions of working people actually matter enough to pay attention to. So, this takes us to a whole new world, essentially. A world where the working man's vote matters a little bit, but initially not very much. So the question arises, working class in Britain, laboring people, they have labor organization already in the 1870s and 80s and 90s. But what are the ideologies, the political ideologies of working people? And I think the most obvious answer is that they didn't really have very fledged out political ideologies. So who do you look at? You look at the labor figures and the socialist theorists in Britain at the time, and you look at their influence. So who do we have in Britain at this point is the question that is a leading theorist in terms of what the working class wants and needs. And I think the most obvious name that comes up is Karl Marx. Because Karl Marx and Frederick Engels and the rest of their organization had moved to Britain in the latter half of the 19th century. That's where he wrote Das Kapital, wrote all 3 volumes of Capital in Britain. He lived there, he died there, he's buried there. Okay? So Marx is a big figure in Britain, you'd think. But in reality, no one really paid much attention to Karl Marx in Britain, even though he lived there and died there. Not until the 20th century do even the most radical socialists in Britain pay a lot of attention to Karl Marx. But his name is certainly one to recognize. Another figure in the 19th century who's important is Robert Owens. And here we have Robert Owen, not Owens, sorry about that. Robert Owen, and Robert Owen is often referred to as a Tory Democrat because even though he's very radical, he always voted with the Tories. His ideas were probably more consistent with the Disraelian Tories and the Gladstonian liberals of the 19th century. That aside, we have this whole idea of Owenism. And Owen's an interesting figure because he's definitely a part of what we call the socialist critique or the socialist theorists of the 19th century. But Robert Owen was not really a political socialist in the traditional sense. That being a socialist who wants to nationalize industry, that wasn't exactly Robert Owen's beef. Okay? Robert Owen wanted to maintain the market capitalist system in Britain, but had a real strong emphasis upon a need for individuals to cooperate and to organize within the context of market capitalism. So he's often seen as a utopian socialist because he wanted individuals to simply go off and start their own utopias. He didn't want the state to begin to nationalize industry or anything like that. And he's actually really popular among socialist figures in Britain in the 19th century. So his ideas are definitely more influential in the minds of all the people we're going to be talking about today than Karl Marx. But Karl Marx was influential on certain figures. There was an organization called the Social Democratic Federation. I'm just going to refer to them as the SDF for the sake of this presentation. And they were run by a figure by the name of H.M. Hyndman. And Hyndman, I've always seen him as being a very sort of, I guess you'd say, an egotistical kind of figure. He was definitely very Stalin-esque. Within his organization, he definitely was a quasi-Marxist sort of figure, but just more in how he interacted with people, he was very much so, I'm the guy in charge, I have sort of a tendency to promote a cult of personality centered around myself. He was very controlling of the organization's newspaper and the organization's bureaucracy, and eventually people got really fed up with this. And the SDF eventually schismed, and a separate organization developed called the Socialist League. Socialist League. Alright, so the Socialist League emerges. The Socialist League is kind of interesting because its founding members include William Morris, who's a very prominent figure in 19th century Britain, and Eleanor Marx. So Eleanor Marx is the daughter of Karl Marx, and she was one of the leading figures in the Socialist League. And she'll come up again and again as we look more into these organizations. Another really influential group that I think is in this family that I would have to mention to go to bed tonight and not feel bad about myself are the Fabians. And the Fabians are a group that's kind of interesting. I would have a very hard time defining the doctrines of the old Fabians in terms of what they thought. And it would seem that there was a huge gray area there. But I've always seen them as being very educated, more wealthy individuals that wanted to contribute to this, this socialist family of thought in 19th century Britain. And the Fabians include some famous figures, such as Sidney Webb and George Bernard Shaw. So that which I've written up on the board probably sums up the socialist, laborist kind of theoretical base that you find in 19th century Britain when the Voting Reform Acts are handed down. And what I think is a commonality within all of these organizations, figures, and the ideas that they produced is that they did not appeal to working people in Britain, okay? If you grabbed your average worker on the streets in Britain and you asked them about Marx, if you asked them about Owen, you asked them about Heinemann, or the Socialist League, or the Fabians, they either didn't know what you were talking about or they didn't care. It was far too abstract. It didn't appeal to people. So none of these thinkers or schools of thought appeals. They cannot be the bulwark for organization for working people. They don't appeal to the common man. But suddenly we have a new figure that emerges. And his name is James Keir Hardie. Okay? James Keir Hardie. Write his name up here because he's a very important man. James Keir Hardie. Okay, and James Keir Hardie was born in 1856. He was the bastard son of a farm maid named Mary Keir, and they lived in Lanarkshire, Scotland. No one really knows who his real father was. But a few years after he was born, a gentleman by the name of David Hardie married his mother, and thus he took his stepfather's name, Hardie, as his own last name. James Keir Hardie's father, David, was a ship's carpenter, and his status of employment was very, very irregular. Okay? So Keir Hardie grew up in a situation where very often neither of his parents had a job, and thus they were very, very, very poor. So like a lot of poor kids in Britain in the 19th century, he went to work at a very young age. At age 7, he was working as an errand boy around Mid-Lanarkshire, and by the time he was 10, he was working in the coal mines, which was really probably the most lucrative industry in Lanarkshire at the time. So he's working initially as a trapper boy at age 10, and the whole idea of a trapper boy in the mines is that you have a young person, a little person, who is going to sit by the doors, the little mine shaft doors that kind of swing open and close. And they're going to open and close the doors to let miners and coal and tools in and out. And then they're going to rotate the opening and closing of these doors to essentially work kind of what's supposed to be a very technical ventilation system throughout the mining pits. But it amounts to, for the sake of the young child that's being stuck in the mines, basically some kid sitting in the pitch black darkness of a mining pit for 16 hours a day, which probably isn't an ideal environment for a child to be raised. Okay, so he's growing up down in the dark pits of the mine, literally, and it's seen as probably a less than enjoyable childhood down there. A very dangerous job, by the way, because a lot of times they'd forget about little trapper boys they left down in the mines, and they'd be stuck down there for days. Cave-in could occur at any time, and the trapper boy might not find out about it until, you know, it's happened a long time ago and he's in really bad shape. So it was a very dangerous and probably a very rough job for a 10-year-old like James Keir Hardie to take. James Keir Hardie never went to school, okay? But his mother supposedly would read with him at night and then whenever he wasn't working, and that was very important for Keir Hardie because later on in life he is a very, very talented orator and he's a very, very talented writer. And there's no question that if he was illiterate, that probably wouldn't have happened. So it's a good thing that he learned how to read and write at a young age. So he gets to be a teenager and in his early 20s, and when he gets to that point, he's already politically active. Early on, he is probably what we'd regard as a Gladstonian liberal. In fact, he would have testified to that in his writings. But the other movement that really appealed to him was the temperance movement, and the movement that is derived from the Christian churches throughout Britain. Keir Hardie's parents never had him baptized. They didn't attend regular services. They were not religious people. But Keir Hardie found the churches in Scotland to be very appealing because in his mind, they were the only people that were genuinely working to help the interests of the working peoples and the poorer peoples of Britain. So he cooperated with a lot of religious organizations early on in life and was a huge advocate of the temperance movement, that movement that was advocating for prohibition, getting rid of alcohol, in Britain and the United States. And Keir Hardie supposedly never drank alcohol, and he used to say things all the time basically to the effect that there are two human responses to hardship: the bottle and getting off your bum and actually doing something about the problems in the world. And obviously Keir Hardie favored the latter of those two options, but in Keir Hardie's worldview, most people chose the former. They chose the bottle. So there's records of him advocating for things comparable to prohibition, and he wanted the courts to further enforce restrictions on known abusive alcoholics going into bars. You know, he wanted the bars to be required by law to throw those people out, and he did a lot of work early on in his life in that area. But then, as Keir Hardie got a little bit older, when the 1880s were starting up, he became very influenced by a figure by the name of Henry George. And Henry George is an American, okay? Henry George. He's an American, and he promoted his own variant of socialism. Sometimes they refer to his political economic theories as Georgism, and really his biggest work was produced in 1879, that is Progress and Poverty. And Keir Hardie's a literate man, and poverty, okay? Yeah, Keir Hardie's a literate man, and he reads a lot, and he gets a copy, and it's the first socialist theorist that ever really appealed to him. And he becomes a little bit more radicalized, and then in 1886, he decides to try to organize the miners of his own pit, okay? He's no longer working as a trapper boy. He had taken on more adult roles in the mine. But he's still in those same mining pits that he'd been in since he was 10 years old. And now in 1886 he tries to organize these guys, and he's fired and blacklisted. His career as a miner is over. So he falls on his pen and he founds a periodical, a newspaper, that appeals to working miners in Scotland. And there's a lot of coal miners in Scotland, so he's got a lot of people to read his works, and he calls this newspaper The Miner. Later on in his political career, he would change the name of The Miner to The Labor Leader, I believe. And this would be his journal. People would read what he had to say. And this is when people start to notice him for the first time. And he begins to develop relationships with a lot of those figures I referred to earlier. Hyndman, Eleanor Marx, who was actually supposedly a good friend of his. I know he met Frederick Ingalls at least once. He knew George Bernard Shaw and Sidney Webb. He began to develop relationships with all of these people. And the general impression that they all had of him was that he was different in the sense that he actually was a working class guy in Britain. And his rhetoric was very, very different. Most of them spoke a lot like Karl Marx. They used big words like bourgeoisie and proletariat. They referred to all sorts of really abstract concepts, such as the whole, materialistic dialectic that we get from Karl Marx, the whole idea of synthetic and diametric opposites, thesis and antithesis, in some kind of a coherent progression throughout history. Very abstract concepts like that are at the heart of all those other socialist figures, and that does not appeal to your average working man in Britain. And it doesn't really appeal to Hardy either. So he speaks in terms that your average person can understand, yet he's clearly very literate, he's a very good speaker, he's a very good writer, and that is very, very appealing to lots of people. So now we have Keir Hardie, and he's going around Britain, writing, speaking, getting people all fired up, and he eventually emerges as a figure in the Trade Union Congress. So the Trade Union Congress, I'm just going to refer to that as the TUC in this presentation, the Trade Union Congress. And the Trade Union Congress was an organization in late 19th century Britain that basically brought all of the major labor unions in Britain together under one roof. And they were able to work together. Okay? They don't have any political party of their own. They have nothing like that going on. They work with the Liberal and Tory parties in Parliament, mostly the Liberal Party at this time. This is sort of the Gladstonian era. And they're working with all of these MPs. Well, they're not really changing their ideology around, the Liberals and the Tories that are working with the TUC. Okay? Even though you have the enfranchisement of workers, it doesn't really change the political landscape of Parliament at all. So in 1887, Keir Hardie went to a TUC session at Swansea, and he stood up, and he's like a nobody, really. I mean, yeah, he's been doing a lot of writing, he's been doing a lot of speaking, but he's not like someone that was really a household name at this point. And he stood up and he challenged a lot of MPs who were working very closely with the TUC up until this point. Individuals such as Henry Broadhurst, for example, he took him on in front of everyone. And he accused Broadhurst of working with fellow Liberal MPs who owned sweatshop factories and were very anti-labor in their politics. And thus he basically called Broadhurst a traitor, and there was always a big rivalry between Broadhurst and Hardie throughout his entire political career. But what's really significant in 1887, when Hardie challenges Henry Broadhurst at the TUC session in Swansea, this is the first time we see Keir Hardie as a major figure in the TUC, and we also see him as a figure that won a lot of support from the people that were watching him that day. And from this point on, Hardie is going to be a staunch advocate within the TUC for what we refer to as an independent labor party, or I'll be referring to as an ILP. The idea that we're going to send independent MPs that are independent of the major parties, the Liberals and the Tories, and they are going to be funded by the TUC someday, ideally. If Hardie can ever convince the TUC that's a good idea, which took a lot of years of arguing before they're willing to do. And then they're going to send individual MPs, they're going to directly represent the interests of workers, and they're not really going to form a political party that's going to ever, in Hardy's mind, take the House of Commons and have a prime minister. But he sees them as a potential pressure group because he's irritated that the Liberals are doing the exact same thing that they were doing before they had the working people in Britain, the common folk in Britain on their side. They're doing the same thing, and he thinks that they need to adjust their policies to begin to consider the needs of the common people in Britain. And he thinks a pressure group, an ILP, is going to do this. So he initially can't get any TUC money for his ILP organization, but he runs as an independent labor candidate anyway in 1892 in West Ham, and he wins. So he is a member of Parliament from 1892 to 1895 for West Ham, and there's actually another ILP figure that was elected that year by the name of John Burns, but he basically became a Liberal once he was elected, so he kind of just broke off of the ILP grid altogether and isn't seen as that much of an important figure in Britain's emerging Labour Party. So, we need to talk a little bit about what's going on the side when Keir Hardie is influencing the TUC and serving as an ILP MP in the House of Commons for West Ham. If we go back to the 1870s and the 1880s in Britain, there was a huge economic decline in Britain's industrial sector. Okay? And when you have an economic decline, a recession, unemployment goes up. Okay? And when unemployment goes up, labor power, the value of labor power, goes down because there's less demand for labor power. So with less demand for labor power and devalued labor power, the TUC, the Trade Union Congress, loses an awful lot of its potency. It's now rather weak because you don't have a lot of leverage in collective bargaining when labor is really, really cheap. So they decline. But as they're declining in the 1870s and in the 1880s, those voting reform bills that we talked about earlier are being passed. So you have an industrial working class that's unemployed, they're hungry, they're starving, there are hunger riots in Hyde Park, a lot of discontent, a lot of hardship, but they're enfranchised. So when the 1890s comes rolling along, and the economy is doing better again, all of these people are radicalized a little bit by all of the hardships that they had endured in the 1870s and in the 1880s. So now in the 1890s, having been radicalized by the economic decline of the 70s and 80s, they are more willing to participate in the TUC. So the TUC is revitalized. Plus all of these new people that are now very active in the TUC in the 1890s are enfranchised because of the Voting Reforms Act. So when you put all of that together, it looks like you have a good chemistry to create something comparable to Hardie's ILP, this emerging Labour Party that we're going to see shortly. So, 1890s, TUC, labor organization, it's all a lot more powerful. Business owners, the industrial business class in Britain, notices this, and they become concerned because obviously they don't like this very much. So they're going to push back as well. So they're going to begin to hire lots of private, I call them like private armies, to basically break up strikes, strike breakers, which led to a lot of really violent situations in Britain at this time. And then you also had organizations such as the National Free Labor Association, which was like an organized scab firm. Basically, what they did was they had all these guys on reserve, and if a union went on strike somewhere, then all of the guys that were on reserve within the National Free Labor Association would then take their jobs, and they just fire all the strikers. That was another means of fighting the unions from the business side of the coin, if you're looking at it from their side of the coin. So they're pushing back like this. And the other thing that occurs in the 1890s, the other big pushback by the business class in Britain was a series of lawsuits. And all of these lawsuits were basically suing unions for lost wages during strikes. And initially, all these lawsuits fell apart. But then in 1896, we have this case called Lyons v. Wilkins. And in Lyons v. Wilkins, we see the Amalgamated Engineers Union prop up a strike, and the Employers Federation of Engineering Associations sues for compensatory indemnities for lost income during the course of the strike, and they win. And this is something that's won within the Court of Appeals in Britain in 1896. And it's a huge setback for labor, for kind of obvious reasons. If you can't go on strike, if you can't legally go on strike, even the most peaceful and benign strike, then you have no collective bargaining power. So that's a huge setback for the TUC. But like all of the setbacks for the working class in Britain at this time, and for the TUC that kind of represents them, you see that every time there's a setback, the people become radicalized just a little bit more and more committed to this cause. So in 1899, the TUC finally likes this idea of an independent labor organization, and they found what we call the Labor Representation Committee, okay? The Labor Representation Committee, which I'll call LRC, for the LRC organ. And it basically serves the purpose of the old ILP, the idea being that now we have a labor party. Ladies and gentlemen, this LRC that was founded in 1899 is in essence the Labor Party. It just isn't called the Labor Party. It doesn't have that many MPs or anything like that. But it was technically founded in 1900, in February, in Memorial Hall near Ludgate Circus. It was derived actually from a resolution within the TUC that was initially proposed by George Barnes of the Amalgamated Society of Engineers. Okay? So this is the origins of the LRC organ. And the LRC is funded. It's a funded political party by the TUC. And in 1900, they send Keir Hardie back to the House of Commons. So Keir Hardie is back in the House of Commons in 1900, and he's actually sent with another figure named Richard Bell, and history kind of repeats itself because Richard Bell was never seen as a very influential labor figure. So all of this happens, and I'm sure you're beginning to see a trend at this point that every time one side succeeds in any way, the other side, the two sides being working people and the business owning class in Britain, whenever one of those two sides has any victory, the other side pushes back harder. So now that this LRC is founded, the business owning class continues to push for basically the precedent set in Lyons v. Wilkins. That idea that if you strike, I can sue you for compensatory indemnities for lost income, which would render your collective bargaining rights null and void. Okay? So this culminates in the Taft-Vale judgment. The Taft-Vale judgment. And the Taft-Vale judgment was handed down by the House of Lords in 1901. So this basically amounts to the equivalent of the Supreme Court in the United States reaffirming a controversial decision in a federal appellate court from a few years earlier. That would be the American equivalent to what just happened. So, when this occurs in 1901, because that's the year Taft-Vale happened, 1901 here, we see a huge skyrocket in labor activity because one side gains a little ground, the other side has to gain some ground. This is an outrage among the working class in Britain. So you see in the beginning of 1901, 376,000 people that are technically affiliated with the TUC. By the end of 1901, you have 469,000 individuals associated with the TUC. So this is a huge, huge development for the TUC and thus the LRC in 1901. So this is the situation leading up into 1906 approximately. Labor is just steadily gaining ground, but there's no ability to strike, which is bad for the TUC, but is ironically good for the LRC, because the LRC is now getting more political support as the TUC has less economic support. It's an interesting trade-off. Less economic power leads to more political power in this early stage in the history of the British Labour Party. By 1906, the British Labour Party had 29 MPs. Now, you may have caught something I said earlier. The people that were founding this LRC organ, or this Labour Party, were not trying to form a new party that had any real chances of taking the House of Commons and, getting a Labour Prime Minister. These individuals just want to create a pressure group within the House of Commons that can make the Liberals and the Tories cater to their demands. And they're trying to do this, but they really couldn't until this point. But then in 1906 they can, because now they have 29 MPs in the House of Commons. That's a decent amount. So they're able to negotiate with the Liberals. We're now at a point where every time an election takes place, the Labour Party and the Liberals are going to sit down and they're going to divvy up the constituencies, because they don't want any situations to emerge where they split the vote in a constituency and the Tories take a seat that Labour or the Liberals would have gotten anyway. And there were a lot of people within the Liberal camp that accused the early Labour figures of being paid by the Tories to split the vote, so that the Tories could win elections. So that was something that was really in the backs of people's minds a lot at this point in history. So now they're divvying everything up, they're talking a lot, and they have a certain relationship with one another. There's also relationships that are developing within the Labour Party. Early on, you have two blocks. You have the Unionist bloc, which is led directly by union leaders who are interested usually just in the interests of their union, which they're loyal to. And then you have the Socialist bloc, which are people that are not affiliated with a union, but are kind of usually a bit more radical, I think, than the Unionists. Sometimes they're more educated, but that's, I guess, debatable. It depends on the situation. Keir Hardie is really the leading figure in the Socialist bloc of the early Labour Party, whereas Arthur Henderson is probably the biggest figure in the Unionist bloc in the early history of the Labour Party. And eventually in 1906, the Labour Party is able to negotiate effectively with the Liberals to get the Liberals to pass the Trade Disputes Act of 1906. And this turned back the clock. It did away with the Taft-Vale judgment, and it did away with Lyons v. Wilkins. They're gone. So now you can strike, and you don't have to worry about paying back compensatory indemnities, and the strikes are regarded as legal, which is a huge, huge concession to the TUC. So this is in 1906. Things continue along these lines, the Labour Party just gradually getting a little bit more power every year, and then we find ourselves in 1909. And this is when we have something called the Osborne Judgment. Okay, the Osborne Judgment. In the Osborne Judgment, we have an individual by the name of Osborne, and he sued his union because his union dues were going to support a political party that he didn't like and name the Labour Party. By the way, by 1909, they actually were calling it the Labour Party. They made that change back in 1906, around the time that they were doing away with the Taft-Vale decision. So now we actually do have something called the Labour Party. It's still the same LRC organ, but now we can actually call it the Labour Party. Labour Party. And he doesn't like the Labour Party, Mr. Osborne. So he doesn't want his union dues going to the Labour Party, so he sues, and the courts rule in favor of Mr. Osborne. They don't think he should, that his union dues should legally be allowed to go to the Labour Party. They think that's a bad thing, and thus it becomes illegal for union dues to support a political party. Well, that's bad news for the Labour Party, because the Labour Party is basically the union's party. Okay? All of their money basically comes from unions. So now they have no money. They're basically penniless because they lost their main source of income. It's around this time that we have a figure named J. Ramsay MacDonald who's going to become very, very influential in the Labour Party. He would actually become the first prime minister from the Labour Party later on. But he's becoming more and more an important figure because he's able to bridge that gap between unionists and socialists in the Labour Party, and he also has very good relations with Lloyd George and other liberal figures. He had been a liberal MP for a long time. So he's able to work out a lot of issues within the Labour camp. And he was able to negotiate effectively with the Liberals, with Lloyd George, to overturn the Osborne judgment in 1909. Lloyd George and the Liberals were trying to promote an insurance reform bill in 1909. Eventually it would be something that we'd see later with the People's Budget in 1911, but they were looking for labor support. And Lloyd George looked to MacDonald, and MacDonald was willing to give him that support, even though the socialist bloc within the Labour Party really did not like the liberal insurance reform bill. But now they have the support of the Labour Party on that item, and in exchange, the Liberals give the Labour Party something they've been demanding for a very long time: state-sponsored stipends for MPs. Most figures that were MPs up until this point were very, very wealthy, and they didn't have to work to provide income for the wealthy MPs in the past did not have to work to provide an income for themselves so that they could eat, okay? Because they were very wealthy individuals, and they could just not work and they'd be fine economically. So they could quit their jobs if they had them and serve as MPs. Labour MPs early on cannot do this, okay? Labour MPs cannot do this because they are working class people. They stop working, they stop eating. So that was really hard for working class people to give up their livelihoods for a political career that probably won't last. But now, there's a state stipend waiting for them. So when you're working as an MP, you're still being paid enough to eat, and that's a huge plus. And then the other concession was that the Liberals were willing to overturn the Osborne judgment, and they did this in the Trade Union Act of 1913. So the Trade Union Act of 1913 does away with the Osborne judgment. The Osborne judgment is dead and gone. It is gone. It is no more. No more Osborne judgment. Which means that the TUC is now giving lots of funds to the Labour Party, and the Labour Party is continuing to grow. And it's moving in the right direction from their standpoint, that being a position of stability and influence within the British Parliament. Then 1914 comes rolling along, and over the summer World War I begins, as I'm sure you all know. And the world wars are going to fundamentally change the political climate in Britain forever. The Labour Party supported Herbert Asquith and Lloyd George's governments, but it never supported World War I, or Britain's role in World War I. There was a lot of division in terms of whether or not they should support it, whether or not they should oppose it. Keir Hardie was basically a pacifist and was a very staunch opponent of Britain's role in World War I. He's really out of the political scene, though, at this point. He's sick and old and often a nursing home by 1914, but he's still doing a lot of writing. He wrote a book called India at the time where he talks about imperialism in India, and he was, of course, very anti-imperialistic. And he's doing some writing and some activism, but he's really off on the side, and then he dies in 1916. So no more Keir Hardie after 1916. So now we have guys like Arthur Henderson, who's really big. He was the Unionist bloc leader, and then we have guys like J. Ramsay MacDonald, who later become the first Labour Prime Minister in Britain. And they maintain close relations with the Liberals, but it's important to note that after Lloyd George's term as Prime Minister, the Liberal Party never took control of a government in Britain again. Lloyd George is, to this day, the last Liberal Prime Minister. So after World War I, the next biggest party after the Tories or the Conservatives would be the Labour Party. And I think that what I've just gone through really is the story of how the Labour Party developed from something that was on really, really shallow ground to something that's very stable and lasting to this day in history. In 1906, the Labour Party only had 73 MPs in Parliament. By 1914, when World War I began, they had 179. So this really is the story of how a party goes from a group of people, a class of people that has only recently been enfranchised, that has no real ideology, no planks, no figures that represent them, to a concrete, a stable, and an influential political organization called the British Labour Party. So thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a like or consider subscribing. If you noted anything that I said that was wrong, please let me know in the comment section below. All comments are appreciated, and I definitely thank you for your time. Have a good day.